Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. All right, buckle up, everybody. We're going deep on this one. Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
It's a classic.
Yeah, and we're going to pull out those aha moments from your notes and highlights.
The stuff that really makes you think about, like, how we think.
Right. Not just what we think, but all the weird mental shortcuts and biases that, kind of mess with us.
And the best part is Kahneman isn't just some armchair philosopher. He's a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist.
Exactly. So this is serious science backing up these ideas.
Yeah, no, this isn't just like, pop psychology. This is the real deal.
So his big idea is that our minds use two systems. System one is all about fast thinking, like gut feelings and instincts.
The stuff that just happens automatically.
And then there's system two, the slower, more deliberate, logical side.
The one that actually takes effort to use.
And Kahneman uses real-world examples and experiments to show how these systems work in our everyday lives.
Like how they shape our decisions, our judgments, even our beliefs.
And often lead us to make the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah, the predictable errors, those are the ones that really get you thinking.
So it's not just what we think that matters, but how we get there, right?
Totally. And that how is often a wild ride through all sorts of cognitive biases.
Okay, so let's talk about one of those biases that really grabbed my attention, expert intuition.
Ah, yes. The idea that some people can just, know things instantly.
Like chess masters, seeing the winning move in seconds, or a doctor making a split-second diagnosis.
Yeah, it seems magical, almost superhuman.
But Kahneman says, not so fast.
He says it's not magic, it's pattern recognition.
So years of experience in a specific field, like chess or medicine.
Exactly. They've seen countless situations, so their brains are wired to spec patterns that others miss.
Okay, so their intuition is based on like a massive database of knowledge.
Precisely. And that works great in stable environments where those patterns are reliable.
But there's a catch, right?
Oh, yeah, a big one.
What happens when those patterns are unreliable or the feedback is unclear?
Like trying to predict the stock market or long-term political trends.
Yeah, those situations where there are just way too many variables at play.
Exactly. And that's where expert intuition can lead us astray.
Because we're trying to force patterns onto something that's essentially random?
We crave certainty, even when it's not there.
Okay, so this reminds me of a story Kahneman tells about the Israeli Air Force.
Oh, yeah, the one about the pilot training.
Yeah. They were trying to figure out why one squadron had way more losses than another, even though they were flying the same missions.
It seemed like there had to be a reason, right? Like some difference in training or something.
Exactly. They look at everything, pilot behavior, debriefing procedures, you name it.
And they came up empty.
No clear explanation.
Nope. And that's when Kahneman stepped in.
What'd he say?
He basically said, stop looking, it's just luck.
Wow. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the best, huh?
Yeah, and it's a humbling reminder that we don't always have control over the outcomes, even when we think we do.
So, accepting the role of chance, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. And that leads us nicely to another cognitive bias. Kahneman talks about the law of small numbers.
Ooh, this one's sneaky.
It really is.
It's that tendency to believe that even small samples are representative of the whole population.
Like, you flip a coin 5 times, get heads every time, and you're convinced it's rigged.
Right. But statistically, that's totally possible.
Yeah, but our brains love to find patterns, even when they don't exist.
And this bias impacts everyone, from scientists to investors.
We see a few data points, and our brains start weaving stories, even if those stories are false.
And what I find fascinating is that Kahneman himself admitted to falling for this bias.
Oh, yeah. He realized some of his own research was based on studies with sample sizes that were too small.
Even a Nobel Prize winner isn't immune.
Exactly. It shows how deeply ingrained these biases are.
So thinking about the law of small numbers, it makes me think about the Gates Foundation.
Oh, yeah. They're huge investment in small schools.
Like billions of dollars poured into creating these smaller schools.
Based on research showing that smaller schools tend to perform better.
But there's a catch, right?
Yep. That research was based on a limited number of successful small schools.
So the law of small numbers was skewing the results.
Exactly. Some small schools will outperform larger ones just by chance.
And the Gates Foundation basically fell for this compelling but misleading story.
It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of jumping to conclusions based on limited data.
So what's the takeaway here? How do we avoid this trap?
Well, be wary of small sample sizes. Don't just rely on anecdotes. Look for the bigger picture.
Okay, so from misleadingly small numbers to something even more manipulative, the anchoring effect.
Anchoring, one of my favorites.
That's like a Jedi mind trick, right?
It kinda, yeah. It shows how easily our judgments can be swayed by completely random information.
Okay, walk me through it.
So imagine spinning a wheel of fortune that's rigged to land on either 10 or 65.
Okay, got it. So far, so good.
Then you're asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the UN,
Okay, but where's the anchor?
the number on the wheel. People who spun a 10 gave significantly lower estimates than those who spun a 65.
No way. Seriously,
Yeah.
a random number influenced their guess about something completely unrelated.
That's anchoring in action. Our brains latch onto that initial number, even if it's irrelevant.
Wow, that's crazy. And I bet this happens all the time in real life, right?
Oh, yeah, all the time. Think about negotiating a salary.
If the employer starts with a low ball offer,
That number becomes the anchor, even if you know you're worth more.
or buying a house, the asking price is the anchor, right?
Exactly. It sets your expectations, even if it's completely arbitrary.
So how do we fight back against this anchoring effect?
Well, Kahneman suggests thinking the opposite. Actively look for arguments against that anchor.
So if someone gives you a low ball offer, remind yourself of your skills and experience.
Precisely. Engage your system too, the rational side, and don't let that anchor drag you down.
Okay, so it's about consciously pushing back and bringing in more objective information.
Exactly. The more aware you are of these biases, the better equipped you are to handle them.
Okay, makes sense. So we've got anchoring, and now let's move on to the availability heuristic,
Ah, yes. This one explains why we often fear the wrong things.
because it's all about what comes to mind easily, right?
Precisely. The easier it is to recall examples of something, the more likely we are to overestimate its probability.
Like if you just saw a news report about a plane crash.
You might be more afraid of flying, even though it's statistically safer than driving.
Right. Or maybe you had a bad experience with a certain type of food.
You might avoid that food forever, even if it was just a one-time thing.
So our personal experiences and memories can really skew our perceptions.
Absolutely. And the media plays a role here too, because they tend to focus on rare but dramatic events.
Like shark attacks or lottery winners.
Exactly, which makes us overestimate their frequency.
So we end up worrying about things that are actually very unlikely to happen.
Yeah, it's the availability heuristic in action.
So being aware of this bias can help us make more rational decisions about risk.
Right. And it highlights the importance of, critically evaluating the information we're exposed to.
Don't just accept things at face value. Do your own research and try to get a more balanced perspective.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about how our memories and the ease of recall can influence our thinking, but now let's talk about framing.
Ooh, this one's a classic.
Oh yeah, it shows how the way information is presented can dramatically change our choices.
Okay, give me an example.
So, imagine there's a deadly disease outbreak and you have to choose between two treatment options.
High stakes.
Right. Both options have the exact same outcomes, but they're described differently.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So option A is framed in terms of lives saved. If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved.
Okay, makes sense.
Option B is framed in terms of lives lost. If program B is adopted, 400 people will die.
So the same outcome, just worded differently.
Exactly. But here's the thing. People tend to choose different options depending on the framing.
Wait, really? Just the wording changes their mind.
Yep. It's like our brains are wired to respond differently to gains and losses, even when they're objectively the same.
So framing can literally hijack our decision-making process.
It can, and it's even been shown in brain studies, different areas of the brain are activated depending on the framing.
So it's not just a psychological phenomenon, there's a neurological basis for it?
Yeah, it's pretty wild, right?
It is. So how do we avoid falling for these framing effects?
Well, awareness is key. Just knowing that framing exists can help you spot it in action.
And maybe try to reframe the problem yourself, look at it from different angles.
Exactly. Don't just go with that initial gut reaction. Engage your system too.
Okay, so we've covered expert intuition, the law of small numbers, anchoring, availability, and framing. And I'm seeing a theme here.
Oh yeah, what's that?
It seems like we're not nearly as rational as we like to think we are.
That's a pretty accurate assessment.
Our thinking is full of these predictable errors, and understanding them is the key to making better decisions.
Absolutely. And next up, we're going to delve into one of the most powerful forces that shapes our choices, loss aversion.
Ooh, this is where things get personal, right?
It sure does.
It's that idea that the pain of losing something is greater than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value.
Precisely.
And Kahneman illustrates this with an experiment using coffee mugs.
Oh, yeah, the mug experiment, a classic.
So they divided people into two groups, those who were given a mug and those who weren't.
The sellers and the buyers.
Right, and the sellers, the ones with the mugs, were asked how much they'd sell their mug for.
And the buyers were asked how much they'd pay for one.
And the results were pretty shocking, right?
They were. The sellers wanted twice as much to give up their mug as the buyers were willing to pay.
That's crazy. So the pain of losing that mug outweighed the potential gain of getting money for it.
Exactly. And this loss aversion plays out in all sorts of ways in our lives.
Like why we cling to losing stocks, hoping they'll bounce back.
Or why we resist negotiating a salary cut, even when it might be the best option.
It even explains why it's so hard to break up with things or even people, even when we know it's the right thing to do.
Because the fear of loss can be paralyzing.
So how do we deal with this loss aversion? How do we stop it from controlling our decisions?
Well, it starts with recognizing when it's at play. We need to consciously shift our perspective.
So instead of focusing on what we're losing, we should focus on the potential gains of letting go.
Exactly. Sometimes the best path forward involves accepting a small loss to avoid a bigger one down the road.
Okay, that makes sense. So from loss aversion, let's move on to this fascinating distinction Kahneman makes. The remembering self versus the experiencing self.
Yes. This one gets into the very nature of happiness and well-being.
It's like we have two selves battling it out inside us.
Yeah, the self that lives through experiences in the moment and the self that remembers those experiences later.
And those two selves don't always agree. Yeah.
Right. And often the remembering self wins out, even if it leads to choices that aren't in our best interests.
Can you give me an example? I'm having trouble picturing it.
Well, think about a vacation. You might be annoyed by long lines, bad weather, all those little annoyances.
Right, those things that always seem to happen on vacation.
But then when you look back on that vacation later, those negative experiences fade away.
And you mostly remember the highlights, the good times.
Exactly. Our memories are selective. They edit out the bad stuff and focus on the good.
And this can impact how we make decisions, right?
It can, because we might choose experiences based on how we think we'll remember them later.
Rather than how we'll actually feel during the experience itself?
Precisely, which is kind of backwards when you think about it.
So we might be chasing the wrong things, focusing on creating memories rather than enjoying the moment.
It's a possibility, and it's something to be mindful of.
So maybe the key is to be more present, more aware of our actual experience as it unfolds.
Yeah. And not get too caught up in how we think we should feel or how we'll remember it later.
So being present, more mindful of our actual experience as it unfolds, rather than focusing on the highlight reel we might create in our memories.
Exactly. And this leads us to another fascinating concept that Kahneman explores, the peak end rule.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this peak end rule.
It builds on the idea that our memories are heavily influenced by the most intense moments of an experience and how that experience concludes.
So if you want to create a positive and lasting memory, you need to focus on creating a few peak moments of joy, excitement, or wonder, and ensuring the experience ends on a high note.
Precisely.
So it's not about trying to make the entire experience a non-stop thrill ride.
Yep.
It's more about strategically crafting those peak moments and that grand finale.
Exactly. This has implications for all sorts of things, from planning a date night to designing a product or service.
So if you're a restaurant owner, you might want to focus on creating a few signature dishes that really wow your customers, and then end the meal with a memorable dessert or a special touch.
Exactly. It's about understanding how our memories work and using that knowledge to create more positive and satisfying experiences for ourselves and others. But we also need to remember that our memories aren't just influenced by these peaks and endings. They can also be distorted by our own biases and assumptions.
Okay, that makes sense. We've talked about how memories can sometimes lead us astray, influencing our choices in ways that might not be in our best interests. But you're saying our memories aren't always reliable in the first place.
Right.
Sometimes they're actually warped by our own perspectives.
Precisely. And that's where hindsight bias comes into play. It's that all-too-human tendency to look back on past events and think, I knew it all along.
Yeah, like when your favorite sports team wins and you're all like, called it.
Exactly. But did you really predict it, or are you just rewriting history in your mind?
Good point.
And this can be a real problem, especially in fields like finance, politics, and even medicine.
Because it can lead us to overestimate our ability to predict the future.
Exactly. We might think we're brilliant strategists or investors when, in reality, we just got lucky.
It's so much easier to believe we knew it all along than to admit we were wrong.
Absolutely. And this is why it's crucial to be aware of hindsight bias and to cultivate intellectual humility, admitting that we don't have all the answers and that we're all susceptible to making mistakes.
So recognizing the limits of our knowledge and being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
Exactly. And this leads us to another critical aspect of Kahneman's work, the role of luck and randomness in our lives. We often attribute success to skill and talent while blaming failure on external factors. But Kahneman argues that chance plays a much bigger role than we might like to admit.
So you're saying that some degree of success or failure is simply due to factors outside our control.
Things we can't predict or plan for.
Like, you could have the best business plan in the world, but if the economy tanks, you're in trouble.
Exactly. He uses the example of comparing the performance of companies. If you look at a group of similar companies over a long period of time, you'll find that a significant portion of their success or failure can be attributed to factors outside of their control. Things like changes in the market, unexpected technological advancements, or even just plain old luck.
So sometimes it's not about having the best strategy or the most talented team. Sometimes it's just about being in the right place at the right time.
Precisely. And this has significant implications for how we evaluate performance, whether it's our own or that of others. We need to be more willing to acknowledge the role of chance and less quick to judge.
So next time we see someone succeed, we should remember that luck might have played a role.
Yeah.
And next time we experience a setback, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. It's not always about personal failings or lack of effort.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the limits of our control and accepting that randomness is an inherent part of life.
This reminds me of a quote by the Roman philosopher Seneca. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity.
Oh, I like that.
So maybe it's not just about pure chance. Maybe it's about being prepared to seize those opportunities when they arise, even if we can't always predict when they'll appear.
That's a great point. It's about finding that balance between taking responsibility for our actions and acknowledging the role of factors outside our control.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but we're not done yet. In the next section, we'll explore some practical strategies for overcoming our cognitive biases and making better decisions. So we've uncovered all these ways our minds can, play tricks on us, but just knowing about these biases doesn't magically make us better decision makers.
Right. It's like having a toolbox full of shiny tools, but no idea how to use them.
Exactly. So let's talk about some practical strategies we can actually use, starting with the outside view.
Ah, yes, the outside view. This is a powerful one.
It's about countering that tendency to be overly optimistic, right?
Exactly, especially when we're making plans or predictions.
Like, we all think our project is going to be the exception. We'll finish early, under budget, no problem.
The classic planning fallacy.
But the outside view helps us inject some, much-needed realism.
It forces us to look beyond our own little bubble.
So instead of focusing on the specifics of our project,
We look at similar projects that have already been completed.
so if you're writing a book, you'd research how long it took other authors to write similar books.
Exactly. Get a sense of the average time it takes, the typical challenges they face.
Even if you think your book is going to be different, faster, easier.
Right, because we all tend to think we're special, that will beat the odds.
But data often tells a different story.
It does, and the outside view helps us ground our expectations in reality.
Okay, so the outside view helps us be more realistic. What other strategies can we use?
Well, another powerful tool is pre-commitment.
Pre-commitment. Remind me what that is again.
It's basically making a decision in advance before you're faced with the temptation to change your mind.
So kind of like tying yourself to the mast, like Odysseus in the Odyssey.
Exactly. Because we all know willpower is a finite resource, it's easier to make the right decision when you're not under pressure in the heat of the moment.
So if you're trying to save money, you could set up an automatic transfer to your savings account each month.
Perfect example. The decision is already made. You don't have to rely on your willpower to resist spending that money.
Or if you're trying to eat healthier, you could pre-pack your lunches for the week.
Yeah, so you're not tempted by unhealthy options when you're hungry and rushed.
So it's about creating systems that support our goals rather than relying on willpower alone.
Precisely. And this can be applied to all areas of life. Exercise routines, work schedules, even social commitments.
It's like outsmarting your future self, right?
Exactly. You're making the decision when you're in a good headspace and then sticking to it, even when things get tough.
Okay, so we've got the outside view, pre-commitment. What else?
Well, this one might seem a bit mundane, but it's incredibly effective. Checklist.
Checklists. Like the ones pilots use before takeoff.
Precisely. Checklists are a simple but powerful way to reduce errors and improve performance.
Because they help us remember all the important steps, even the little ones.
Right, and they prevent us from making careless mistakes, especially when we're under stress or feeling rushed.
So if you're planning a big event,
You'd create a checklist, all the tasks you need to complete, no matter how small.
or if you're a doctor, you might use a checklist before surgery to make sure you haven't missed anything.
Exactly. It's about having a system in place to ensure consistency and accuracy.
Checklists seem like they'd be helpful in any situation where precision is important
They are, and they're especially valuable when our brains are overloaded.
because they help us offload some of that cognitive burden.
Precisely. They free up our mental energy to focus on the bigger picture.
Okay, so checklists are a must-have tool in our decision-making arsenal. Any other tips?
One final piece of advice. Pay attention to your emotional state.
Yeah, emotions can really mess with our thinking.
They can. When we're stressed, anxious, or angry, we're more likely to make impulsive choices.
The kind we regret later.
Exactly. So before you make an important decision, take a moment to check in with yourself.
Like, how are you feeling? Are you calm and collected, or are you feeling overwhelmed?
If you're not in a good headspace, it's best to postpone the decision until you've had a chance to cool down.
Or maybe talk to someone you trust, get a second opinion.
Absolutely, because making big decisions when you're emotionally charged is rarely a good idea.
So it's all about recognizing our limitations and using strategies to counteract them.
Exactly. Kahneman's work shows us that we're all susceptible to these cognitive biases
But it also gives us the tools to overcome them.
and make better, more thoughtful choices.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into thinking fast and slow, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest one is that understanding how our minds work is the first step to improving our decision-making.
By recognizing these biases, we can start to counter them.
And make choices that are more aligned with our goals and values.
It's about being more mindful, more deliberate, more intentional with our thinking.
Exactly. And remember, we're not aiming for perfection here. We're all human.
We're going to make mistakes, but the key is to learn from them.
And keep striving to make better choices.
So as you go about your day, pay attention to your thought process.
Notice those moments when those biases start creeping in.
Challenge your assumptions. Seek out different perspectives.
And be kind to yourself. We're all works in progress.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay.
So that's our deep dive into the brilliant work of Daniel Kahneman. We hope you enjoyed this journey into the fascinating world of cognitive biases and decision-making.
It's been a pleasure.
Now it's your turn, dear listeners. What resonated with you? What are you curious to explore further?
What insights will you apply to your own life?
The journey of self-discovery and better decision-making continues. See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.